If this area of your hips often feels tight or bound, or your hips just generally feel unstable, then you've arrived at the right part of the internet. Likely, if you've had issues with your hip flexors and they just often feel tight, then you've probably found yourself in some of these positions. And although the tissues around the hips may feel as if they're tight, that's typically a byproduct of a lot deeper rooted problem that's going on. This sense of tightness from the body is usually a result of the hips having a poor relationship between how they interact with your lower and upper body. And it's not until this relationship is restored that you'll feel the hip flexors begin to work in unison with other chains of muscles in the body and be on your way to addressing the root cause. Throughout the course of this video, you'll learn a deep understanding as to how the hips play a role in our movement and be taken through a series of techniques that will engage your hip and leg muscles in ways that maybe you didn't think was possible. Let's get into it. So for our first technique, we are gonna be on the floor, and what we're gonna be practicing in this one is specifically trying to offset any of the pressure that we might be getting into the hip flexors to hopefully offset some of that sensation of tightness that you may be experiencing in conjunction with trying to improve overall sensation and stability into the pelvis. So to start with this one, we're gonna be on our back. You can grab a block for your head here, and we're gonna take our feet up against the wall. And it's gonna be important that we roughly have the knees at about 90 degrees. I don't want you to be too extended where my legs are way up or too low where you have this harsh angle. Just about 90 degrees and just kind of find that sweet spot. And we're gonna work through a wall bridge in a little bit of a different format than you may be familiar with. So if you've gone through any of my videos in regards to breathing and creating proper intra-abdominal pressure, I'll put a tag up here or here if you haven't. And you can kind of see how we're gonna access first pressure. I'm not gonna get too much into that video because this is more hip specific, but we are gonna be working on that mechanism of creating some intra-abdominal pressure relative to the sensation that we're creating in the pelvis. So once you have that general sense of pressure set in the abdomen, we're gonna apply a little bit of pressure into the wall with our feet, but we're gonna focus more on pressure down. So I'm gonna be pulling the wall down, and that is gonna be what elevates my hips slightly off the floor. Now it's important to make note here is that the objective isn't for me to lift and bridge my hips up this way, because that could just be creating more compressatory sensation into the hip flexors. Instead, what we want to do is maintain a baseline of intra-abdominal pressure. You can even be touching your lower back here, and we want to try to neutralize that curve. So whether you're in an excessive lordosis or have an excessive curve, or maybe you overly clench your glutes and you excessively posterior tilt, we're going to be trying to keep the glutes actually relatively soft here. And we're gonna be trying to create some hamstring feedback through the foot drive down. The more that you create the foot drive down, the more you're gonna feel the hamstrings come online. And we're just gonna try to keep kind of the big areas around the glutes, the quads, the hip flexors relatively soft here. And we're just gonna do an isometric hold for anywhere between about 20 to 25 seconds. What I like to think about as I'm going through this is that I'm taking my hips just a few inches off the ground, and then I'm thinking about projecting my tailbone this way. So I'm doing just a slight projection of the tailbone towards the wall in conjunction with that pull down of the feet. And if you're feeling into that sensation, you'll probably feel the hamstrings come online in a big way. As I mentioned, work through this for anywhere between about 20 to 30 seconds, take a break, and then I'd repeat that 2 to 3 times. So now that you have a general understanding as to how to engage the hamstrings, what pelvic stability kind of roughly feels like from our first exercise, we're gonna start to incorporate this into a little bit more of a dynamic motion where we start to challenge the range of the hip flexor as well as just our hips in a more nuanced way. So you can grab 2 poles here just for some stability. Or if you want to challenge yourself further, you can certainly take these out of the equation. And you're going to want to grab a small stool, and you can use kind of varying heights because based on the height, it's going to be more or less challenging. The lower it is, the easier it's going to be. The higher the stool, the more challenging it's going to be. And what we are going to start with is by getting into a split stance position. And what I want you to try to mimic is some of that sensation that we were working on in our first exercise up against the wall. So just getting a baseline of feedback kind of between the foot and the hip, maybe sensing some of that hamstring tension coming online. And with this back leg, we're gonna take it right off the ground. So my left leg is now off the floor. I'm gonna stay seated in this hip, and I'm gonna slowly start to take this knee up without letting my lumbar excessively dump here, or kind of go into an excessive flexion. We're gonna try to keep the lower spine relatively neutral as this knee comes up, and that is gonna challenge our hip flexors on this open chain leg, so in this case my left, and now keeping the height on this left side, I'm gonna start to go through an extension. I'm gonna hold that, again, not letting my lower back or anything overcompensate here. I can feel the quads and the hip flexors somewhat contract. I'm gonna go into a hamstring curl, and then I'm gonna gently sit back into that hip. I'm regathering sensation into this leg, building that through, maintaining that connection between the foot and my hip, maybe getting the upper body a little bit more involved here as well. And I'm really gonna challenge that range, trying to stay above the object of your choice in front of you, reset, and we're just trying to kind of feel a smooth glide between our starting position and our end position, and then just resetting between those two. What I would suggest here is that as you are going through this motion, try to make it fluid. Try to see if you can notice any points where it gets maybe a little bit stuttery. See if you can kind of just smooth that out and work between anywhere between about 8 to 10 reps for this one. So as we do, let's get into a little bit more of a dynamic and rhythmic motion through the phase of hip extension. If we want to adequately create length through our hip flexor and also retrain how the pelvis starts to interact with our body in a more dynamic way, then rhythmic movement is gonna be our gateway to that. So for this technique, you can grab a dumbbell. I'd suggest anywhere between about 5 to 15 pounds, depending on how competent you are at getting into your hips into a hinge position in a single leg variation. So I'm gonna be using 10 pounds here. And to start with, I'm gonna take my right leg in front. And what we're gonna do initially is just build a baseline of a rhythm of just kind of catching the dumbbell in our right hip. So I'm keeping about 80 to 90% of my weight on this lead leg. I'm kind of just feeling feedback come in and out of that leg. And then when we come up, we're gonna try to go either to a overhead position with the dumbbell, or we can just come to a curl while I still stay connected to this right foot. So I'm just kind of feeling weight transfer to the heel and then back to kind of the mid and forefoot in this standing position. And I'm just trying to sense that the musculature between the hamstrings, the glutes, maybe even some quads and adductor are all kind of active. It's as if all the tissues around the leg are staying connected through that entire motion, which is providing the stability through my hips. And I'm just kind of moving dynamically in and out of that. In terms of rep range here, I'd recommend working anywhere between about 12 to 15 reps. Just try to keep the lower body and upper body somewhat soft. I think we already did all the kind of pre-work we need to kind of create that stability. And now we're just allowing our body to kind of flow in and out of that position. So as you have come to learn throughout the course of this video, if you do want to relieve your hip flexor tightness and improve hip stability, there's far more involved than simply just stretching your hips and doing mobility drills all the time. In fact, it's actually more about creating an overall connection and unification of the musculature between the pelvis, the legs, and kind of how that works with our abdominal pressure and upper body. If you wanted to learn more about the specifics and the nuances involved in creating this intra-abdominal pressure and kind of bridging that gap between the pelvis and upper body, then you can go watch another video I did on that right here.